My name is Adriana Reed. I am 33 years old. For 12 years, I gave everything I had to Maple and Stone, our family restaurant. I slept on flour sacks after closing shifts, rewrote menus by hand, and watched it grow from a cozy corner spot into one of the most sought-after places in town. I even secured a $750,000 contract that would change everything. But then came the announcement. My parents, with proud smiles on their faces, named my brother Noah, the same brother who had never spent a single night in the kitchen, as CEO. And I was given a creative title under his command. So I packed my things and walked away. When they desperately called begging for help, I simply said, "Talk to your CEO." If you are watching this video, write your country in the comments and hit like and subscribe, because what happened next turned my family upside down. Our story didn't begin with Maple and Stone. It began decades earlier, when my grandparents left Dublin in the 1960s with nothing more than 2 suitcases, a handful of family recipes, and a stubborn belief that life in America would give their children more than they ever had. They settled in Oregon, in a modest neighborhood where people still knew their neighbors and left their front doors unlocked in the summer. My grandfather, Patrick, found work in a small bakery owned by an Italian immigrant. He arrived every morning before dawn, his hands raw from kneading dough, his shirt stained with flour. He didn't complain. Baking was his way of staying connected to home, to the Ireland he had left behind. Soon, the regulars began asking him to make soda bread, just like his mother used to bake. It wasn't long before the bakery smelled like Dublin every morning, fresh loaves cooling on the rack, their crusts still crackling from the oven. My grandmother, Maura, was no less determined. She stayed home with the children during the day, but by evening she would cook great pots of stew, shepherd's pie, and soups so thick you could stand a spoon in them. Neighbors would drop by, and somehow, no matter how many people crowded into that little kitchen, there was always enough food for everyone. My mother used to tell me that people who were complete strangers would end up sitting shoulder to shoulder, dipping bread into bowls, laughing like old friends. That sense of warmth of food being more than just nourishment, but a way of binding people together, stayed with our family for generations. My mom and dad grew up surrounded by it. They saw firsthand how a hot meal could soften bitterness, how a loaf of bread could start a friendship. And while my uncles and aunts scattered into other careers, teachers, plumbers, nurses, my parents clung to the dream of one day turning that legacy into something more permanent. In 2006, they did it. I was 14 at the time, a teenager who didn't understand what it meant to risk everything. But I remember the day my dad drove us into downtown Portland and pointed to an old stone building on the corner of Alder Street. The place looked half forgotten. The roof sagged a little, the windows were smudged with dust, and the paint on the wooden door had chipped so badly you could see 3 different colors layered beneath. But my parents' eyes shone with excitement. "This is it," Dad said. "This is where it starts." I didn't get it. I thought, start what? A restaurant in this dump? But my mom gripped his hand, and I knew it wasn't just about the building. It was about carrying forward something bigger than themselves. The following months were chaos. Every weekend, my brother Noah and I were dragged into cleaning duty. I scrubbed grease off walls I didn't know could get so dirty, while Noah complained until Dad finally let him supervise from a corner with a soda in his hand. Mom worked late into the night at our kitchen table, drawing up menus on loose sheets of paper, writing and rewriting until her handwriting slanted into exhaustion. Dad learned the intricacies of restaurant permits, battling city paperwork with the same stubbornness that had carried his parents across the ocean decades earlier. When Maple and Stone finally opened its doors, it wasn't glamorous. We had secondhand furniture bought from a closing diner, mismatched plates that Mom tried to disguise with checkered napkins, and only enough money for a single neon sign that flickered so often people joked it looked haunted. But people came. First neighbors, curious to see what the Reeds were up to, then friends of neighbors. And slowly, strangers who heard about a little stone building serving bread that tasted like home and stews that warmed you better than any heater could. The restaurant became more than a business. It was our family's second house. I spent nights peeling potatoes at the prep table, listening to my parents reminisce about Grandma Moira's recipes. Dad would tell stories about how she could feed 20 people with a pot meant for 10, how she believed that food always multiplied when shared. Customers loved hearing those stories, and soon, Maple and Stone wasn't just about eating, it was about belonging. I still remember the smell of those early years. The scent of onions frying in butter at 5 in the morning. The sweet, yeasty air that wrapped around me when Dad pulled fresh bread from the oven. The way the stone walls seemed to hold on to warmth in the winter, keeping us safe inside even when it rained endlessly outside. Those details became the backdrop of my adolescence, shaping me in ways I wouldn't fully appreciate until years later. Looking back, I think my parents saw Maple and Stone as a promise to their own parents that the sacrifices made in leaving Dublin hadn't been in vain. It wasn't about money back then. It wasn't about prestige. It was about continuing something deeply personal, something fragile and sacred. From the very beginning, it was obvious that Noah was the favorite. My parents never said it out loud, of course, but you could feel it in the smallest details, how their eyes lit up when he entered the room, how they laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, how they always described him to others as our brilliant son. Noah was born with a smile that seemed to get him out of anything. He had this way of tilting his head, flashing those dimples, and suddenly rules didn't apply. If he spilled juice on the new carpet, Dad would ruffle his hair and say, "Boys will be boys." If I forgot to take the trash out, it was, "Adriana, you really need to be more responsible." At the restaurant, the favoritism was even clearer. Noah would stop by after school, charm the waitresses, wander into the dining room, and sit with customers like he was the host of the evening. Everyone praised him, such a charismatic young man. He'll go far, while I was in the back, sweating over a cutting board, learning how to julienne carrots without nicking my fingers. I mopped floors sticky with spilled soda, carried heavy crates of produce, and stayed after closing to scrub grease off pans that felt twice my size. Still, I didn't complain. I thought, if I work harder, they'll notice. If I prove myself in the kitchen, they'll be proud. That was my mistake. I believed effort would balance out charm. The difference between us grew even starker when college came around. Noah announced he wanted to go to Stanford, a dream so out of reach it felt like a joke. The restaurant was barely staying afloat at that point. We had weeks when payroll looked impossible, when suppliers threatened to cut us off, when my parents whispered late at night about whether they had made a mistake. And yet, when Noah brought home that acceptance letter, they acted like it was the second coming. They mortgaged the house. I can still remember the day Dad spread the papers out on the kitchen table, his face both anxious and proud. "It's worth it," he said. "For Noah's future." Mom nodded along, tears in her eyes, like this sacrifice was noble, almost holy. No one asked if it was reckless. No one asked how the restaurant would survive. No one asked what it meant for me. At that time, I had already been accepted into a state university culinary program. It wasn't glamorous, but it was my dream. The tuition wasn't outrageous compared to Stanford, but still too much for a family juggling mortgage payments, a struggling restaurant, and Noah's sky-high expenses. When I hinted that maybe they could help me a little, just a small contribution, Mom sighed, her voice dripping with guilt I later realized was rehearsed. "Honey, you're so independent. You'll figure it out. And besides, your brother really needs us right now." So I did figure it out. I worked 3 part-time jobs just to afford tuition and rent. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays I was a barista at a cafe that opened at 5 a.m., which meant I lived in a haze of espresso steam and aching wrists. On Tuesdays and Thursdays I worked as a hostess at a mid-range Italian restaurant, smiling until my cheeks hurt, pretending not to notice when customers treated me like furniture. And on weekends, I cleaned offices, vacuuming empty cubicles, scrubbing break room sinks, emptying trash bins sticky with soda cans. Every paycheck went straight to tuition, books, and rent. I clipped coupons, bought day-old bread, and lived on ramen noodles more times than I care to count. There were nights I collapsed onto my mattress with my clothes still on, too exhausted to shower. Meanwhile, Noah was posting pictures from Stanford, sunsets over palm trees, tailgate parties, road trips with friends. My parents followed his adventures like proud fans of a celebrity. Noah joined a business club, Mom would announce at Sunday dinner. He's already networking with future CEOs. Dad would nod approvingly, adding, "That's my boy. He's going to take us places." And me? If I mentioned a new recipe I was studying or a professor who complimented my technique, their responses were polite but distant, as if they were humoring a child's hobby. The irony was bitter. I spent my nights studying recipes, obsessing over techniques, learning from every mistake, while Noah barely scraped by. His grades were mediocre at best, his interests scattered. He called home constantly asking for more money my parents scrambled to find, sometimes skipping their own medical checkups or ignoring overdue bills. "He's under a lot of pressure," they'd say, defending him. I was under pressure too, but no one noticed. I don't even know what hurt more, the exhaustion of working myself raw or the realization that none of it would ever measure up to the shine of Noah's smile. It didn't matter how much I gave, how many nights I sacrificed, how much sweat I poured into both my studies and the restaurant. In my parents' eyes, Noah was destined for greatness, and I was simply the one holding the mop, keeping the lights on in the background. That blindness, willful, stubborn, unshakable, became the foundation of our family dynamic. And though I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that one day my work would speak louder than their favoritism, deep down I knew I had already been cast in a role they never planned to let me leave. So, I was pouring myself into something entirely different. Food had always been more than recipes to me. It was history, memory, and art all bound into one. After finishing my degree at the State University, I knew I couldn't stop there. If I wanted to become the chef I dreamed of being, I needed to learn from the very best. Therefore, I packed up my few belongings and moved to New York. I didn't have much, just a couple of suitcases, a cheap apartment in Queens with water stains on the ceiling, and the kind of determination that doesn't let you sleep at night. During the day, I worked unpaid internships at some of the toughest kitchens in the city. At night, I washed dishes in hole-in-the-wall diners just to make rent. My shoes were always damp from hours on my feet, my hands raw from scalding water and harsh detergents, but I didn't complain. Because every morning, I got to stand in kitchens where Michelin-starred chefs shouted, demanded, and expected nothing short of perfection. I learned discipline in New York. The kind where one wrong move, a sauce too salty, a garnish placed half an inch off, could end your shift in humiliation. I learned that sleep was a luxury, not a guarantee. But I also learned flavors, techniques, and traditions from chefs who had studied in France, Italy, and Japan. I learned to respect ingredients, to understand the chemistry behind bread rising, the patience behind slow braises, the subtlety of a perfect vinaigrette. Those years hardened me, sharpened me, and gave me a foundation Noah would never even begin to understand. After New York, I spent a year in Chicago, working under a chef who was as much a scientist as he was an artist. His kitchen was less of a workplace and more of a laboratory. He pushed me past exhaustion, forcing me to invent, to innovate, to question why a dish had to be made the way it always had been. Tradition is the root, he used to say, but innovation is the branch. Those words stuck with me. The sacrifices during that time were endless. I missed birthdays, holidays, weddings of friends who eventually stopped inviting me because they knew I wouldn't come. My relationships suffered. I couldn't hold on to anyone who wanted late-night movie dates or lazy weekends. My whole life was in the kitchen. Some nights, after 14 hours of service, I would walk back to my tiny apartment, collapse on the mattress on the floor, and wonder if it was worth it. But deep down, I knew it was. Because each scar on my hands, each burn on my forearm, each night of aching bones was building me into something stronger. By the time I graduated from those years of training, I had offers, real offers. A well-known restaurant chain courted me with a six-figure salary, benefits, and the kind of stability most people my age would have killed for. It would have been easy to say yes. To put on their uniform, follow their menu, and live comfortably. But when the contract sat in front of me, pen in hand, I thought about maple and stone. I thought about my parents' tired faces, about the cracked stone walls that still smelled of stew and bread, about the customers who had once felt like family. I thought about what my grandparents had built in their small Dublin kitchen, what my parents had risked everything to continue. And I couldn't walk away. So I turned the offer down. Instead, I packed my kitchen utensils, kissed New York and Chicago goodbye, and came home. When I walked back into Maple and Stone, I was full of ideas and fire. I wanted to bring everything I had learned back to that old stone building. I wanted to breathe new life into the menu, modernize the kitchen, and build something that wasn't just surviving but thriving. I could have chosen the easy path, a corporate salary, recognition, maybe even fame one day, but I chose my family. Because I still believed. I believed that if I poured my knowledge, my heart, my blood into Maple and Stone, one day my parents would see what I had become. One day, they would look at me and say, "Adriana, this is yours as much as it is ours." I came back to Maple and Stone like a woman returning to a half-finished sentence. The bones were good, the stone walls, the battered oven that still ran hot, the regulars who wanted a place to belong, but the language needed rewriting. I started with the menu. I kept my grandparents' heart in it. Soda bread with a crackly crust and a knob of salted butter, a leek and potato soup thick enough to coat a spoon, a stout braised beef that tasted like rain and hearth. Then I layered in what New York and Chicago had drilled into me, a smoked trout salad with pickled shallots and watercress, turnip gratin with sharp cheddar, roasted carrots glazed in cider vinegar and honey. In spring, asparagus with lemon mint grummelada. In winter, parsnip puree and a mushroom pie wrapped in flaky pastry. I wrote a plant-forward stew that still felt like comfort and developed a gluten-free soda bread that didn't crumble in your hands. I stopped chasing trends and started chasing seasons. I drove out on my days off to small family farms and shook hands until my palms smelled like soil. Back Cove Farms brought us grains that still held the morning's chill. Penobscot mushrooms delivered crates of oyster and lion's mane that made the kitchen smell like clean earth. A couple in Freeport raised lamb the way my granddad talked about it, slowly, with respect. We bought milk from Sebago Lake Dairy and churned our own butter in batches that made the line cooks grin like kids. I built relationships, not invoices. If a grower had hail damage and needed to move beets, we wrote a beet special that week. If they had too many strawberries, I macerated them for a shortcake that sold out in an hour. Inside the kitchen, I created a training system because talent without structure burns out. I wrote a binder, the Stone Book, with station maps, prep lists, and exacting standards for every dish. How hot the plate should be, where the sauce lands, how many leaves of parsley make it onto the stew. 3. Torn by hand, never chopped. Pre-shift lineups became ritual. We blind tasted the soup. We checked the bread crumb by crumb. We talked about the farmers by name so the team knew these weren't anonymous deliveries. They were people. I coached knife grips, corrected posture, made everyone learn the difference between a simmer and a sulk. We cross-trained dishwashers into prep cooks onto grill, and hosted Monday workshops on stocks, emulsions, pastry dough. We paid fairly, tightened tip pools, put sick days in writing, and bought decent clogs for anyone who couldn't afford them. Front of house got the same rigor. I wrote steps of service we could actually live with, greet within 1 minute, water within 2, bread on the table warm enough to fog the butter. Servers tasted every new menu item before it ever met a guest. We practiced how to say no with kindness, how to handle a wrong plate without panic, how to read a table that needed privacy versus a table that wanted stories. I replaced the clunky POS with a system that didn't crash at 7 p.m. on a Saturday and started tracking our food cost, our waste, our comps, our wince-worthy mistakes. The goal wasn't perfection. It was accountability. We rebuilt our community, one plate at a time. On Tuesdays, we ran Hearth Night, a 3-course stew supper for $35 that filled the room with students, nurses, and line workers just off shift. In July, we hosted a farm dinner in the parking lot with twinkle lights and folding chairs borrowed from the church down the street. The lamb farmer told stories while people licked cider glaze off their fingers. I said yes to every radio spot and morning show demo, even when my voice shook. I posted our prep like it was a love letter. Flour on the table, the first rhubarb, the burnt edges of a caramel that still tasted right. Nothing fancy, just honest. The numbers followed the feeling. In year 1, we stabilized. In year 2, we stopped holding our breath. In year 3, the reservation book started filling faster than we could print it. By year 5, turnover had tripled. We ran out of gift cards every December. People scheduled anniversaries months in advance. Proposals happened in the corner booth with the nicked tabletop we refused to replace. On weekends, a line formed at 4:30, folks in wool hats stamping their feet against the cold while the windows fogged from the heat of the grills. The kitchen became a school and a family. Cooks who had never stayed at a job longer than 6 months were with us for years, growing steady hands and steady lives. We sent 2 through culinary night classes. One of our dishwashers, a quiet kid who barely spoke during his first weeks, mastered sauces and cried the first night he called the pass and nothing crashed. When the oven died mid-service, the team pivoted like a flock of birds. We seared on cast iron, finished on burners, and sent every plate hot. Guests applauded. I shook for an hour after, laughing into a towel so no one would see. Then came the magazine. A photographer arrived on a windy day in October, all black jeans and lenses and questions about my grandmother's stew. We styled bowls near the window with the best light and cut into a loaf that cracked exactly right. When the issue of Bon Appetit landed Best Restaurants in New England, our name sat there like a dare. The phone lines jammed. Out-of-towners showed up with suitcases, saying they'd added us as a last-minute stop. I took the copy home and left it on the table, open to our page, a little stunned, a little giddy, smelling faintly like ink and roasted onions. At home, though, the praise never shifted the weather. My parents took the success as if it were inevitable, as if the tables had filled themselves and the stew had learned to simmer alone. This is what Maple and Stone was always meant to be, Dad said, which was his way of saying finally. Mom hung the magazine in a frame, then set it in the hallway, not the dining room. Over coffee, they spoke about the future like it was waiting just outside the door in a suit and polished shoes. When Noah comes back, Dad would say, tapping the table with 2 fingers, he'll handle the big picture. He's got the vision. Mom would nod, eyes soft. Your brother will know how to take this to the next level. I stirred my tea until it went cold and told myself it didn't matter, that the work mattered, the staff mattered, the guests mattered. But the truth is, even as Maple and Stone bloomed under my hands, my parents were always looking past me, saving a seat for someone who wasn't there. Noah came back like a returning champion, even though there wasn't a trophy in sight, only a sun-faded hoodie from a failed California startup and stories about runway that made my parents nod as if he were quoting scripture. The announcement was delivered over Sunday pot roast, as if bad news were easier to swallow with gravy. His app had shut down, investors had pivoted away. He said the words briskly, then swept on to the part that mattered. He decided to come home and help. My mother's hands flew to her chest. My father's eyes shone. You'd think a parade might round the corner any second. The very next week, he was on the floor of Maple and Stone, not as a guest or a son visiting, but as a commander taking over a small country. He scheduled a strategy alignment with the staff at 9 a.m. sharp, projected slides onto the stone wall, and told a room of cooks and servers that hospitality was legacy thinking. He talked about unlocking efficiencies, scaling touchpoints, and digitizing the guest journey. Hannah, our senior server, whispered to me that it felt like being scolded by a toaster. His first proposal was to replace waiters with tablets. Self-ordering is the future, he said, pacing. Guests don't want small talk, they want frictionless. I pictured Mrs. Keenan, who came every Thursday since her husband died, handing her grief to a glass screen and waiting for the beep that meant her stew was approved by the algorithm. I said no. He smiled like a teacher with a restless child. Chef, I hear you. But this is about progress. Then came frozen meals. He wanted to package our stews, flash freeze them, and get them into supermarkets by fall. He had mock-ups already, glossy cartons with Stone Kitchen in block letters and a logo that looked nothing like us. He said families would heat and experience. I said we served food we watched over, that flavor changed hour to hour, pot to pot, and that a freezer would flatten what made us ours. My parents exchanged a look, there she goes again, and asked me to be open-minded. He waded deeper. He tinkered with table turns, shaving minutes off the guest cycle as if conversation were waste. He suggested swapping butcher cuts for cheaper ones and pitched a supplier who could pre-cube vegetables in sealed pouches. No one will notice. But I noticed. The kitchen noticed too. Carrot coins arrived the exact shade of defeat. He installed QR menus that refused to load for half the room and a new reservation platform that double-booked us on the second Saturday. Teething pains, he said, smiling at a line of shivering guests. When a regular couple asked for the server who knew their wine, he gestured to a tablet stand and said, "Just tap." They tapped the door instead and left. In meetings, he called what I did craft. What he did, he called vision. He'd stroll through the pass with a coffee he didn't pay for and toss a grenade casually. Couldn't this stew be purple? Purple pops online. He wanted neon behind the bar, matte black plates for contrast, and a new name because ampersands are out. I imagined chiseling the words off our sign and felt something crack in my ribs. Staff morale sagged. Hannah cried in the walk-in after he suggested a service fee that gutted tips without raising base pay. Luis, who had learned sauces with me, was told to prep in silence because focus creates throughput. Our dishwasher, a teenager saving for community college, lost 2 shifts to a robot he wheeled in and called her. The robot beeped like a heart monitor on a bad day and stalled at every corner. At home, my parents repeated his phrases as if they'd invented them. "We're proud of you both," Mom said, then added, "but Noah has a bigger picture view." Dad marveled at the prospect of recurring revenue from frozen entrees, tapping an imaginary spreadsheet. When I tried to explain the difference between dinner and data, Mom patted my hand and told me I was too attached. As if attachment were a flaw in a restaurant. Noah set up innovation sprints on Tuesdays, which meant dragging the entire team off prep to spitball products we had no capacity to make. He filmed us for social media without asking, then overlaid captions that turned living people into slogans. A cook chopping celery became legacy process, manual input. I deleted the video. He reposted it with a winking emoji. He used my title like a leash. "Chef, we'll need you to simplify plating, clean lines, read faster on screens." "Chef, your stew needs a different narrative." When I pushed back, my parents stared at me like I was refusing a vaccination. "He's trying to help," Dad said. "Help like a hammer helps a clock." I watched the floor shift under me day by day, inch by inch. A dining room is a fragile ecosystem, built on eye contact, memory, the way a server sets down bread and knows your bad week without prying. He wanted to turn it into a kiosk. He kept calling the restaurant the brand, then the platform, then the funnel, while I kept calling it dinner. I even tried to compromise. I agreed to test one tablet at the bar. I let him run a weekend with QR codes and preset time limits. I sat through a pitch for par-baked bread shipped to us by someone who had never met a farmer. Each time I said no to the core, he added a smile, a slide, a statistic, and my parents added their nods like exclamation marks. I went home smelling of onions and fury, laid out my knives on the counter like a row of small promises, and wondered how long a person could defend a table before it became a battlefield. Northwest Events found us the old-fashioned way. One of their coordinators came in on a rainy Thursday, ordered soup and soda bread, and stayed long enough to watch us handle a packed dining room without breaking eye contact with a single guest. 2 days later, an email landed in our inbox asking whether Maple and Stone could handle recurring off-site catering for their venues across the city. I read it 3 times, heart thudding. They weren't talking about a one-off gala. They were talking about a partnership. I built the proposal like I build a menu, seasonal, precise, honest. I mapped out 3 years of rotating dishes tied to Oregon's calendar. Spring lamb with minted peas and new potatoes. Early summer salmon with sorrel sauce and charred lemon. Late summer tartlets with sweet corn, peppers, and goat cheese. Fall mushroom pie with cider juice. Winter stews thick with root vegetables and barley. I costed every component down to the last parsley leaf. I wrote training modules for off-site service, complete with diagrams for plating on rented tables and the exact size of the spoons we'd use for saucing. I also added bios for our farmers so clients would know whose hands touched their food before ours. The tasting was nerve-wracking and beautiful. We transformed our back room with folding tables and white paper runners. I briefed the staff like it was a stage performance. Pace, breath, timing. When the coordinators arrived, 6 of them, organized, observant, carrying clipboards that meant business, I watched their expressions the way I watch a pot on the verge of boiling. They asked sharp questions about capacity, allergen protocols, and timelines. I answered without bluffing and didn't promise what we couldn't do. When they asked for vegetarian options that didn't feel like afterthoughts, I brought out a savory barley risotto with charred leeks, dill oil, and a poached egg that sat like a fragile moon on top. They ate quietly, then asked for seconds. I exhaled for the first time in hours. 2 weeks later, the draft agreement arrived. 3 years, $750,000 in guaranteed bookings, with a performance clause that favored consistency over gimmicks. It was, in plain language, stability. It meant predictable cash flow, improved scheduling, raises I'd wanted to give for too long, health benefits we could finally expand, a new oven that didn't lose heat every time you opened the door, fresh paint in the bathrooms, an AC unit that wouldn't cough itself awake in July. I printed the contract and slid it into a blue folder like it was a fragile photograph. I ran the numbers at our kitchen table, circling line items until the paper softened under my pencil. I imagined calling Hannah to tell her we could formalize her manager training, telling Luis we'd cover his night classes, telling our farmers we could commit to steadier volumes. I even allowed myself a small, private dream, taking off one Sunday per month to sit at a table like a guest and taste what we'd built. My parents called a family meeting for Saturday morning. To celebrate, Mom said, and I wanted to believe her. I was in the dining room early, laying out coffee and scones, the blue folder placed carefully in the center like a centerpiece. Noah arrived late, confident and suntanned, tossing his keys onto the host's stand as if he'd owned it in another life. My parents followed, faces bright, hands already clasped in that way they do when they've rehearsed their lines. Dad opened with praise so generous it felt like a slow anesthesia. "What you've done is remarkable," he said, gesturing at the room, at me, at the air. Mom nodded, eyes damp. "We're so proud." For one impractical second, I let the warmth touch me. Then Dad cleared his throat, switched to the business voice he used with bankers, and said the words that cracked the table in two. "We've decided it's time to professionalize leadership. Starting today, Noah will step in as CEO." Silence, like the breath pulled out of the room. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. I looked at the blue folder. I felt my jaw tighten, then release, like it had forgotten how to hold itself together. "And you, Adriana," Mom added quickly, "can finally focus on what you do best, creating. We've made a new title for you, Kitchen Director." She smiled as if she had handed me a bouquet. "Kitchen Director?" I tasted the words, smaller, thinner, a hallway leading away from the room where decisions lived. I stared at them, at their clasped hands and hopeful faces, and I heard myself ask, quietly, "What about the contract?" Dad brightened, as if the question had been scripted. "Exactly. Noah will handle finalizing. He'll take the lead on negotiations and integration. He has the strategic mind for this sort of thing." Noah leaned forward, palms flat on the table like a host at a talk show. "It's a great opportunity," he said, lavishing the phrase with charm. "But we need to make sure it scales. These event folks think in volume, not artisanal." His smile was warm, paternal almost. "Don't worry, Chef. I'll keep the spirit of the brand." Chef. Brand. Finalize. Words like labels pasted over my mouth. I tried to keep my voice steady. But I've been the point person for months. I've already scheduled a compliance walkthrough and, which is why you'll be invaluable in the kitchen, Mom cut in, gentle, like she was rescuing me from a burden I'd never said I wanted lifted. "You won't have to worry about contracts and numbers anymore." I turned to Dad. "They asked for me by name on the tasting invite." "That's wonderful," he said, beaming. "And now they'll have both of you. The best of both worlds." Noah was already sliding the blue folder toward himself. Great. I'll set a call for Monday, he said, flipping to the pricing page. He clicked his tongue softly, salesman's reflex. We can tighten these costs. And maybe we offer them a cross-promo with retail. We don't have retail. I said. Not yet, he answered, like a magician revealing a future from his sleeve. It wasn't a fight, not in the sense of raised voices. It was something worse, the calm removal of a chair while I was still sitting in it. Their smiles stayed on, the words stayed kind. But the decision had already been made elsewhere, without me, printed and signed in a room where I didn't exist. I gathered the staff training docs I'd brought, modules on safe transport, holding temperatures, plating scripts for banquet lines, and hugged them against my chest like a shield. Noah reached for them, and I let go because I still thought, absurdly, that cooperation might mean inclusion. He thanked me as if I'd fetched coffee. Mom put a hand on my arm. Isn't this a relief? She asked, eyes searching my face for gratitude. You won't have to carry everything anymore. I swallowed something hot and metallic. I wanted to say, I have never minded the weight. I wanted to say, I built this bridge, and now you're asking me to watch someone else walk across it and wave. Instead, I nodded once, because I had service in 2 hours and a dining room that didn't care about titles. When the meeting ended, Noah left whistling, blue folder under his arm, already on the phone with someone who laughed loudly at whatever joke he told. My parents lingered, tidying cups that didn't need tidying, telling me it would all work out for the best. I stacked plates, wiped a clean table, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator in the silence that followed them out. The contract, once a promise, now felt like a cliff edge. Stability had been within reach, a hand I could almost hold. Now I stood in the same dining room, the same stone walls, and felt the floor tilt just enough to unsettle my balance. They called it professionalizing. I tied on my apron, washed my hands, and stepped into the kitchen. The line was already warming, the pans already clattering, the crew already asking the questions that make a night possible. How many salmon? Is the pie rested? Life goes on, the kitchen said. But as I checked the soup and adjusted the salt, I could hear the word echo down the hallway where my family had stood. Finalize. 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 And with each repetition, something small and stubborn inside me folded in on itself. I wrote the resignation letter at the prep table before dawn, the stainless steel cool beneath my forearms, the kitchen dark except for the hood lights humming above me. It was 3 paragraphs long, unadorned, factual. I thanked my parents for the opportunity, listed my last day as 2 weeks from Friday, and wrote one final line that hurt more than I expected. Please remove my access to purchasing and scheduling immediately. I printed it on the office laser printer that always smelled faintly of hot plastic, signed my name, and slid the paper into an envelope. My hands shook when I sealed it. I had always imagined I would leave one day with a toast and a hug. Instead, I left a stationary ghost to do the talking. Packing was worse. I gathered my knives, each one a memory, wrapped them in the stained side towel I'd carried for years, and slid them into the canvas roll. I cleaned my drawer, a spool of butcher's twine, a Sharpie that still smelled like onions, a tin of flaky salt, the tiny notebook where I kept ratios and the names of farmers' kids. I found the Polaroid of our first farm dinner and tucked it into my wallet without looking at it. From the office, I took only my stone book, training binder, and the staff schedules for the next month. I left the Bon Appetit issue on the shelf where Mom had placed it, face turned to the wall. I gave the envelope to my parents in the dining room at 7 a.m., before the staff arrived. Dad read the first line, blinked several times, then folded the letter with the care of someone handling a fragile recipe card. Mom said, "Sweetheart, be reasonable," as if I were refusing dessert. I told them I was. I told them the contracts and the titles and the way I was being bypassed made it impossible to do the job I had built. I told them I wouldn't fight with Noah for the pass. I expected pleading or anger. What I got was managerial calm. 2 weeks is fine, Dad said. Let's keep this professional. And that was that. Years of my life converted into the tone you use when you're moving a meeting on the calendar. Within days, the first consequence arrived in my inbox. Northwest Events, polite, precise, asked to reschedule our final tasting to align with the new leadership's vision. The subject line carried Noah's name. I forwarded the email to him with my notes and a summary of their non-negotiables. Hot foods served hot, no pre-seared meats, verified allergen protocol, no ingredient substitutions without written approval, final menus 7 days in advance. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. The tasting was scheduled for a Wednesday. I stayed home, out of principle and self-preservation. At 4:10 p.m., Hannah texted, "He changed the stew." I stared at the screen, then called the kitchen. Luis answered, voice tight. Noah had swapped our signature stout braised beef for a leaner cost profile, tougher cut, thinner sauce. He'd replaced the buttered mash with pouch potatoes and suggested the vegetarian entree could trend lighter by removing the poached egg that tied it together. He'd also cut the bread service to streamline and proposed a dessert bar instead of plated tarts. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. Allergies? I asked. Luis hesitated. He's improvising. On Friday morning, Northwest Events sent a second email. The tone was no longer cautious, it was cold. We appreciate your time. Unfortunately, our teams are not aligned. Several requirements were not understood or were dismissed. The tasting featured unapproved substitutions and items were mislabeled, leading to an allergen mix-up, tree nuts. Given these issues, we are withdrawing the proposed 3-year agreement. We wish you the best. The number $750,000 did not appear in the message, but I saw it anyway, hovering over the text like a watermark. I went to the restaurant to tell my parents before they saw it online. Noah was already there, pacing in front of the host's stand, phone to his ear, saying miscommunication and iterating and pilot smaller. My parents stood behind him, pale, as if the dining room lights had drained them. I said the words out loud, they pulled out and watched them land. Dad rubbed his temples. Mom whispered, "It's just a setback." Noah blamed optics, timing, my unhelpful absence, and finally, the client's risk aversion. I said nothing. The truth was already writing itself. The fallout moved faster than any of us expected. Saturday service. The reservation book had holes in it for the first time in months. By Wednesday, people were calling to confirm that their favorite dishes hadn't changed too much. The new stew was thinner. They sent it back. The QR code menus still stalled, and the tablets at the bar froze mid-order. A regular posted a review. It used to feel like being fed by family. Now it feels like checking out at an airport kiosk. Another, "Why is the bread cold? Why is the butter hard?" Someone else wrote, "Please bring back the soup that saved me after my divorce." Inside the kitchen, the air grew brittle. Hannah handed in her notice first, eyes red, voice steady. "I can't explain this to tables anymore," she said, setting her apron on the desk as if laying flowers on a grave. Luis followed 2 days later. He wanted to cook again, not portion pouches. The dishwasher quit mid-shift after the robot blocked the path to the walk-in and beeped at him for 5 minutes while plates stacked in the sink. Our host took a job at a bakery where the owner knew her name. One by one, the roster thinned. I watched the schedule grow white patches like frost. Costs didn't bend just because the room felt lighter. Payroll loomed. The AC died and came back coughing. We delayed the oven repair another month and made do. Suppliers who had extended grace for years called to ask about late invoices. I took those calls because I couldn't stand the idea of someone else telling our farmers we were short again. "We're adjusting," I said. "We'll make it right." I set my phone down and went into the walk-in to cry where the lettuce couldn't hear me. My parents tried to plug holes with optimism. "We'll do a social push," Dad said, as if hashtags could reseal a breach in trust. Mom suggested a new menu launch party and asked me to design it now that I'd cooled off. I told her gently that I was still leaving. She nodded as if I'd said I was running to the store for milk. The dining room changed in small, devastating ways. Tables that had names in our heads became numbers on a screen. The hum of conversation thinned. People lingered less. They watched the door as if calculating exit routes. The servers who stayed moved more quickly but smiled less, bracing for the next apology. When a guest asked for my stew by name, the new recipe hit the pass shining with oil and lightness where there should have been depth. I sent it back twice. Noah raised his eyebrows at me from the corner and took a note on his phone. On my last day, I arrived early, unlocked the back door with a key that had warmed to the shape of my palm, and stood in the quiet for a long time. The stove grates were black and beautiful. The knives on the magnet strip lined up like soldiers. I brewed coffee and wrote individual notes to the remaining staff, folded them into their envelopes, and taped them to the time clock. To my parents, I left a checklist for the walk-in, a list of prep pars, and a final, stubborn hope. If you decide to bring back the original stew, the ratios are in my notebook under winter. I removed my apron, rolled my knives, and walked the length of the dining room, touching the backs of chairs as if blessing them. Outside, the sign flickered once, then steadied. I waited for the urge to run back in, to fix something, to stay. It didn't come. What came instead was a hollow quiet and the knowledge that the restaurant I had loved was becoming something else without me, with or without success. Behind me, the door opened. Noah's voice floated out, confident, already selling a new idea to a silent room. But I kept walking. I didn't wait for the dust to settle at Maple and Stone. While my parents drafted statements and Noah talked about optics, I started showing up 2 blocks away at a narrow storefront with a faded for lease sign and a floor that sloped toward the back like a gentle bow. The landlord, a retired mechanic with oil under his nails, looked at me over a stack of photocopied applications and asked if I could pay on time. I told him I'd never been late on a bill that mattered. He handed me a pen, and I signed my name with hands that didn't shake. We swept for hours, long strips of dust curling like old paper. The windows were clouded with years of traffic and rain. When we scraped them clean, the light changed the whole room. Hannah showed up with a bucket and no fanfare, then Luis with a toolbox, then our baker with a bag of test loaves still warm enough to fog the air. Someone brought a drill, someone else a speaker that only played if you twisted the cord just so. A friend who did design sketched a sign on butcher paper, Adriana's Hearth. We taped it to the window and took 3 steps back. The word hearth felt like a promise you make with your hands. The money was the part that kept me up at night. I took a small business loan, signed for a second-hand range that came with a dented door and an owner's manual in French, and bartered for shelves with a carpenter who liked our bread. We bought mismatched chairs off Craigslist and rubbed them with lemon oil until they gleamed like they'd been waiting for us. I painted the walls the color of clean cream and left the original brick unpolished, as if to say, we are not pretending to be something we're not. Permits and inspections tested every nerve I had left. The fire inspector tapped a pipe with his pen and said it needed another bracket. The health inspector asked for a thermometer in every cooler. The city clerk needed me to stand in line twice because I filled out the wrong section the first time. I did it all, then went back to the kitchen and wrote opening menus in pencil, erasing and rewriting until the paper thinned at the folds. We kept the bread and the stew because they were part of my bloodstream, but I added roasted chicken with cider juice, a salad that changed with whatever the market offered, and a pear tart you could eat with a spoon. Word traveled by mouth, then by text, then by the kind of photo people post without hashtags because they want to keep a place to themselves. On opening night, we pushed 2 tables together for a family that arrived with a stroller and apologies. I set down extra bread and told them we were thrilled they were there. The floor creaked in familiar places, the range ran hot, the pastry crust blistered exactly right, and when the first guest asked if I was Adriana, I nodded and passed her the butter with hands that smelled like thyme. Almost all of my old staff came with me. Not all at once. Some stayed at Maple and Stone out of loyalty, fear, habit, but one by one, they slipped through the door and asked if there was room. I made room. We wrote a new Hearth book, this time with our names on the first page. We decided together what a family meal should be, what songs sounded like comfort at 3 p.m., which farmer needed a guaranteed order when the weather went strange. We talked about salaries before we talked about schedules. We put copies of the benefits form in Spanish and English on the wall. My parents called, then texted, then called again. The messages took turns between anger, bargaining, and heartbreak. "Please come home," Mom wrote once at midnight. "Your father hasn't slept." Dad left a voicemail. "We can fix this. There's still a seat for you." I stood behind the counter listening to the espresso machine hiss and felt like a person watching weather through glass. I wrote back that I wished them well. I didn't say more. We worked like summer bees. By month 3, we had a rhythm. Bread out by 10, stew at a low murmur by 11, salad greens washed and spun until they squeaked. The lunch crowd filled the room with the sound of forks tapping plates and people telling each other about their days. Dinner glowed soft as a lamp. I wrote chalkboard notes about who grew the carrots and how to warm bread in an oven without drying it. People read them, then asked questions. I felt useful in a way that didn't ache. Northwest Events reappeared exactly 6 months after the day I walked out. The email was brief and precise, just like the first one, but this time they asked if we could host the tasting at Adriana's Hearth. I said yes, and then panicked about space, staffing, plates. The team rose like a tide. We staged the back room with borrowed linens, polished the forks, and ran the menu until our hands remembered it without thinking. When the coordinators arrived, they sat with their notebooks, but not their armor on. You can tell when people want to be convinced versus when they want to be delighted. We fed them the stew that carried both my grandparents and the lessons I paid for in Burns. Deep, steady, honest. We followed with salmon and sorrel, carrots glazed in cider, a barley and leek dish that made them lean over their bowls like children who don't want to waste warmth. For dessert, the pear tart with a spoon and a small pitcher of cream. They asked their sharp questions. I answered without pretending I could do more than we could. When they closed their notebooks, the director looked at me with eyes that had seen a lot of kitchens try to be clever and fail. "We'll only work with you, Adriana," she said. "If you're in, we're in." I didn't cry until after they left. I went to the walk-in, closed the door, and let my head rest against the boxes of greens that still smelled like the field. When I came out, Hannah pressed a pen into my hand, already turned to the page in the contract where my name belonged. The night we signed, the staff brought in a cake someone baked at home with uneven frosting and the words, "We did it," scrawled in chocolate that sloped uphill. We cut slices with a chef's knife because we couldn't find the server. I looked around the room at faces that had followed me through heat, failure, and doubt, and felt the same quiet I felt at the stove when a sauce finally comes together. The knowledge that something is right because it can't be any other way. My parents visited one evening not long after the news made its small way through town. They didn't have a reservation, and the host put them on the wait list without recognizing them. When I came out to the floor to check on a table, I saw them by the window, my father holding his hat in both hands, my mother looking smaller than I remembered. We found them 2 seats at the bar. I poured them water. They didn't look at the menu. For a long time, none of us spoke. The room did what rooms do when people are fed. It softened, then glowed. Finally, my father cleared his throat. His voice had none of the business tone left in it. "We were wrong," he said. My mother nodded. We were so sure we knew what was best. I thought about every night I stood at their stove as a teenager, every morning I set dough to rise in that stone building, every allowance I made to keep the roof from leaking. I thought about the faces of my crew. Then I thought about the way the light looks in here at 4 in the afternoon, soft as bread. "I hope you enjoy your meal," I said, steady as a counter. They ordered the stew. They ate slowly, as if memorizing the taste. When they left, my father set his hat on his head like it weighed more than it used to. My mother reached across the bar and squeezed my hand once, the way she did when I was a child and we crossed a street. They didn't ask me to come back. And I didn't offer. The keys to Maple and Stone no longer sat in my pocket, making a bruise on my leg. The only keys that mattered lay on the table in front of me, bright, ordinary mine. I knew, with the calm that comes after long storms, that I would never go back. Not to the business that taught me to doubt my worth, and not to the kind of family that only recognizes it after everyone else does. Of course, family is important. I will never deny that. The memories of Sunday dinners, the way traditions pass down from one generation to another, all of that matters. But over the last few years, I learned something even more essential. Family means nothing if it comes at the cost of your dignity. I gave my parents my loyalty, my sweat, my years of youth. I believed their approval defined my worth. When they handed my life's work over to Noah, it felt like my heart had been carved out. But when I walked away and built something of my own, I realized a truth I wish I had seen sooner. You can rebuild a business, you can start over from scratch, but once you surrender your sense of worth, you lose everything. The day my parents sat at the bar in Adriana's Hearth, their eyes lowered, their voices thin with regret, I knew I was free. They finally admitted they had been wrong, but by then I no longer needed their recognition. I will never forget what this taught me. Never let even your closest loved ones decide where you belong in life. No title, no inheritance, no hollow words of approval are worth sacrificing the knowledge of your own value. And now I want to ask you, if you were in my place, would you forgive your family and go back? Or would you walk away forever? Share your own story in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, because maybe hearing stories like mine will help you keep your own boundaries strong when life tries to break them.